for cultivating progress across the South, for working to unconditionally improve the lives of all, and for the bold underwriting of every Gravy podcast. SFA thanks our visionary Louisville, Kentucky friends, Pam and Brooke Smith.
The best restaurants reflect, anchor, and at times even help define the communities they serve. From diners and drive-ins to spendy chain chophouses, maintaining a restaurant is a group effort. From managers to line cooks, from servers to overnight cleaning staff, every person working at a restaurant helps make the restaurant work. Restaurant workers comprise one of the largest labor forces in the United States. Even so, these same workers often lack health coverage, live shift to shift, and never have the option to work remotely. In times of unforeseen hardship, like the COVID-19 pandemic or climate disaster, restaurant workers may find themselves forced to make the brutally hard choice between paying rent or buying groceries, or whether to repair a car or go to the doctor. Choices that are all too familiar to too many American workers. And in the absence of systemic change, one organization that's working to respond to and call attention to the needs of the restaurant industry is the Southern Smoke Foundation, whose mission and efforts we'll explore today. This is Gravy.
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 A production of the Southern Foodways Alliance, Gravy tells the stories of the changing American South. I'm Melissa Hall, and Evan Stern has the story.
You learn a lot working in a kitchen. It's speed. It's, its biggest thing is sense of urgency, right? You got to walk around like as if you don't have a lot of time, because you kind of don't.
Scott Lawrence is one of many cooks who make dinner at Blue Dorn possible. Blue Dorn is an upscale new American restaurant in Houston's Memorial District. Scott reports to work hours before the doors open at 5 to prep for service, and with the clock ticking, I gaze into the sleek open kitchen and watch as he cuts some maitake mushrooms and slices onions on a mandolin. On busy nights, he also might shuck up to 100 oysters, which is a skill he says demands caution.
It's all about finding the horn of the oyster. The shucking knife is really rounded at the edge. Some of them are sharpened, but we like to use ones that are rounded. It is less self-harm whenever you miss, which happens a lot when you're learning.
Accidental cuts are just one hazard food and beverage workers like Scott face on the job. Even the most skilled chefs can get burned on stoves or slip on floors. The same goes for dishwashers, food runners, and servers, who tend to work by the hour, often for tips. And as the pandemic taught us, external events can have serious consequences. The owners and staff at Blue Dorn were reminded of this in July of 2024. That's when Hurricane Beryl triggered a power outage that caused them to pause service for 10 days.
During Beryl, we lost power for a week and a half. It was basically a total loss for all the stuff we had in our walk-in. We threw out everything that was old so we could start fresh from new.
For employees like Scott, this also meant lost wages. And while he managed fine, it's not hard to see how someone juggling bills, parenthood, medical treatments, or any number of obligations could have had a harder time. What's more, Blue Dorn is just one restaurant in a big city in our large nation. And when considering the vastness of this $1.4 trillion industry, the vulnerabilities within this labor sector become glaring.
Behind government, it's the second largest employer of people in the U.S. Most of it is paycheck to paycheck. Is the benefit always there? No. Is the gratitude always there? No. And it's very much a blue-collar, passion project-driven lifestyle.
That's Chris Shepard. A James Beard-winning chef, he discovered the kitchen upon quitting college when he took a job washing dishes at a sushi bar in Tulsa. From there, he moved to Houston for culinary school, then cooked at country club buffets and poured wine at Brennan's before opening his acclaimed restaurant, Underbelly. Now regarded as one of the Bayou City's most influential tastemakers, his worldview remains grounded by the lean years he experienced along his professional journey.
I didn't have insurance until later in my career when I owned my own restaurant. And really, that was part of the plan, was to give all of our staff benefits.
According to the Restaurant Workers Community Foundation, fewer than 15% of American food and beverage workers had healthcare coverage before the pandemic. This phenomenon has been caused by a variety of systemic factors. For starters, the American system largely ties benefits to employment and relies on employers to cover most premium costs. Restaurants with fewer than 50 staff members aren't mandated to provide insurance, and even for owners like Chris who want to offer healthcare coverage, high turnover, small margins, and red tape make doing so expensive and challenging.
I'll never forget when we made the decision to have all of our employees get insurance. It was like we just paid the restaurants off, and you start to figure out 250 employees times 12 months, like there's no money for that.
For those employed at large chains, accessing benefits can be complicated by the work itself, which is often hourly, part-time, and sometimes even seasonal. With many in this sector earning low wages, depending on the plans, some might not opt in, as it could mean less take-home pay. As both a worker and small business owner whose profits rarely hit 4% of sales, Chris understands all sides of this equation.
And so as much as industry wants to be able to provide health care at an affordable cost, it just is not there. Because the health care isn't there at an affordable cost.
Adding to this strain is the market itself, as consumers paying for a night out aren't always amenable to additional charges or higher costs to cover these shortfalls. So, to do his part towards filling this hole, Chris founded the Southern Smoke Foundation.
Southern Smoke is an emergency relief organization that provides with two pillars, one, financial assistance in times of crisis, or access to mental health care. We're just there to give a safety net to the food and beverage industry. So when I say food and beverage industry, what does that mean? Anything that it takes to get to a table.
The roots of this organization date to 2015, when one night, after a long shift, Chris's friend and sommelier Antonio Gianola asked if he'd consider hosting a benefit for the MS Society.
So why? And it was after dinner, and I was writing menus, and he's like, well, I was diagnosed with MS today.
This request resonated with Chris for reasons that went beyond helping a friend in need.
About 3 months before that, there was a very young, prominent chef that died by suicide. He started to lose the use of his hands because he was diagnosed with MS, but didn't tell anybody. And Antonio said, I don't want to be like this. I want people to actually come talk to me. I want people to have a conversation with me. I want people to ask me how I'm doing, to understand what I'm going through, and so that I can maybe help other folks with MS that don't want to talk either.
Chris immediately said yes. He'd already hosted a few charity dinners to raise money for various causes, so philanthropy wasn't exactly a new muscle for him. Yet he wanted to do something bigger than usual. Knowing that everyone loves a good party, he talked chef friends Sean Brock, Rodney Scott, and Aaron Franklin into hosting a cookout in Underbelly's parking lot. A few other local restaurants joined in the fun, and with Texas and Carolina barbecue on the menu, they called it the Southern Smoke Festival.
The goal was to raise $100,000. Threw the party and raised $181,000.
Recognizing they were onto something, it became an annual event with funds going to MS and a variety of scholarships. Then, in year 3, 2 months before the festival, Hurricane Harvey blew through Houston, dumping 1 trillion gallons of water in its wake.
I watched the hurt, and I watched the pain of many people. There wasn't any way that there was money getting in the hands of dishwashers or drive-thru employees or farmers or waiters or cooks.
Inspired by the Atlanta-based Giving Kitchen, which provides emergency assistance to food and beverage workers, Chris quickly established a grants committee that figured out a verification process to award money.
I basically just had my staff run out and hit every restaurant they could find with applications and say, this is how you apply. English, Spanish, Vietnamese. We took on 220 applications, and then at the end of it, we had 139 families that we granted $500,000 to. And at that point, we realized that that's where the foundation needs to be.
Hurricane Harvey reshaped Southern Smoke's mission. But while this experience pushed the organization to meet extraordinary needs, little did Chris and his associates know their greatest test remained ahead.
When we come back, we'll learn how the global pandemic shaped the work and mission of Southern Smoke. But first...
Maker's Mark bourbon is aged to taste in Loretto, Kentucky. The Samuels family uses locally grown, soft red winter wheat and sources water from a lake on the distillery's campus. Every Maker's Mark label is printed and die-cut by hand on an antique press, and each bottle is hand-dipped in their signature red wax. All the details matter when distilling quality bourbon. Since Maker's Mark sold its first case of bourbon to the Keeneland Racecourse in Lexington, they have perfected the craft of distilling American whiskey. For their dedication to making great bourbon and for their support of the Southern Foodways Alliance, we thank them. Maker's Mark crafts their bourbon carefully. Please enjoy it that way.
Following Hurricane Harvey, Southern Smoke formally hired an executive director, and with their efforts growing, brought on a second full-time employee in February 2020. Then, on March 4th, Houston reported its first case of COVID. A few weeks later, with the pandemic spreading, all dining rooms in the state were ordered closed. This upended the livelihoods of nearly 1.5 million service workers in Texas alone, and pushed Southern Smoke into uncharted territory.
Middle of April, we had 36,000 applications in nationwide. And we had hired or brought on 40 caseworkers, restaurant managers, bartenders, waiters, and throughout that year, we granted over $6 million to people in the food and beverage industry.
The applications they received ranged from people seeking help with cell phone bills to others struggling to feed kids, fight eviction, or pay for medicine. COVID also pushed them to expand their efforts in other ways as they partnered with the University of Houston to provide free therapy to workers in need.
We went down the path, and in late June of 20, we had access to free mental health care to people in the food and beverage industry in the state of Texas.
This partnership enabled UH grad students to log clinical hours towards their certification requirements, while granting restaurant workers one-on-one therapy at no cost. Well beyond Texas, Southern Smoke now works with multiple educational institutions to offer free counseling to workers in 10 states and Washington, D.C. Chris believes mental health is essential for addressing the core of multiple problems, and is an issue he confronted often as an owner.
Every employee's problems are my problem, and I need to learn how to work better to take care of those problems with them.
Knowing friends and staff who suffered from depression, Chris is also quick to acknowledge that he and most in the industry aren't equipped to handle these matters, which is why these services are vital. He also makes a point to keep himself out of the process of case management in order to avoid conflicts of interest and to ensure that relief seekers remain anonymous. Even so, he was reminded of this program's power a few years ago at the festival, when an attendee approached him to share some words of thanks in person.
Started to walk to the next place I was supposed to be, and this gentleman just kind of popped right in front of me and was like, I need to tell you this right now. He's like, you're never going to know my name, but because of you, my wife and I are still on this planet because of the mental health care program. And I just need to thank you. And I just hugged him, and I turned around, I sat down, and I cried more. It's become way more than I ever thought it would, in the right possible way.
Since its inception, Southern Smoke has facilitated nearly 6,000 free counseling sessions and distributed more than $13 million in relief to workers in crisis. Eventually, they hope to expand their mental health partnerships to all 50 states and build a program that can provide free legal assistance to owners. Yet, when confronted with the economic demands of medical bills and natural disasters, Southern Smoke's noble efforts can at times seem dwarfed by overwhelming needs. As a nonprofit with limited resources, not every case can be approved. To be eligible for grants, applicants need to have worked in the industry for 6 months and are screened on individual needs. Indicators of houselessness, eviction, abuse, and medical crisis take top priority. Then, even when approved, grants only go so far. Still, they argue a little money has the power to reshape lives. Charles Parra agrees.
But I just love being in the whole food environment. You know, you could show who you are, show your colors through the restaurant business.
The son of Colombian immigrants, Charles began working at a young age in his dad's sandwich shop. The environment immediately spoke to him, as he enjoyed interacting with guests and recognized how a good meal could make people happy. From there, he took jobs working in kitchens, hosting and waiting tables, before discovering a passion for bartending.
Creating a cocktail is like creating a meal. So I love being able to experiment and make combinations and create and learn and history from the cocktails.
That's what he got to do behind the bar at Amore Fine Dining, an Italian restaurant in the Houston suburb of Montgomery. He clocked in there on Valentine's Day 2024 to work a long double shift. Then, after closing, on his way home, his life changed in an instant.
I was driving my motorcycle back home, and it was dark, around 1 o'clock in the morning. Cars were speeding by. Out of nowhere, I just lost control of the motorcycle and fell off my bike. I was in and out until somebody came over, and I think it was fire rescue. Someone called the fire rescue. I just remember waking back up in the ICU.
Upon regaining consciousness, he was told he died on the operating table and was revived twice. The injuries he suffered were also severe.
I had 3 main fractures in my back. I broke my left wrist and lost a piece of bone on my wrist. And my left leg was so badly road rash that you could see through the leg. You could actually see right through my bones.
Charles ultimately underwent 7 surgeries. His leg was so badly damaged it required amputation below the knee, and he was forced to remain in the hospital for 30 days. After thinking of his family and young daughter, his concerns immediately shifted to work.
How am I going to be able to perform in a restaurant without a leg and a wrist that most people said I would never be able to use again because I was missing a bone that was not replaceable?
Compounding this situation was the fact he was uninsured. While he eventually obtained catastrophic benefits through the state, his bills currently exceed $80,000 and is unsure what, if any, debts will be able to get cleared. And while his spirits remain strong, he acknowledges that adjusting to this new reality has been tough. He now lives with his sister, and 6 months since the accident, is still navigating a maze of paperwork to obtain disability.
Getting work is hard. Can't work without a leg, so had to get way too healed in process, get a prosthetics run from $12,000 and up.
A friend urged Charles to investigate Southern Smoke. Though he'd never heard of them, he went online, filled out an application, and soon after received a phone call.
They started doing their paperwork, doing their stuff, and they just needed some proof of my living income or what I was doing, pay stubs, simple stuff, and they didn't put me through no loops. And with a very short time, they were able to come through and help out and able to get my prosthetic. So I'm very thankful to them.
At the time I spoke with Charles in August, the prosthetic had just arrived about a week before. Excited to begin physical therapy in a few days, he proudly stood up, said he's been learning how to walk on his own, and showed me his bike and helmet that survived the crash. His wrist has been gaining strength too, and he's committed to getting back to work.
Being a bartender, being a hostess, being a server, even being a cook, you're on your feet. I feel like if I'm strong enough to stand 8 hours on my legs, I could manage the rest.
Returning to the restaurant industry is important to Charles.
It's what I know how to do. It's what I like to do. So I've been looking at other jobs, trying to figure out what can I do in another business and another job. And none of it really fulfills me or feel like I have the talent to do. But that's the goal right now. Getting back on my feet, getting strong, and trying to find a way to get back into a restaurant.
But while Charles is quick to praise Southern Smoke for making this goal more attainable, in a perfect world, organizations like this wouldn't have to exist. Absent major governmental reform, at the very least, he'd like insurance to be more attainable for restaurant workers.
I remember being a server, and they're like, well, you need to make so many hours a week, and you need to make so much pay, and then you have to pay this much. And it's like, when you're making tips and you don't have a base amount that you're going to be making weekly, you cannot even know how much you're going to end up making at the end of the month based on tips. How can you pay for the insurance, or how can you pay for certain things?
He'd also like to see restaurants hire more salaried positions, and is vocal in his belief that $15 an hour for dishwashers and line cooks is too low considering the work. Yet adopting Europe's restaurant model, which generally pays set wages, is a challenge given the realities of American politics, industry, and culture. Our gratuity custom became widely adopted in the 1900s when tipped workers, many of color, were left out of the Fair Labor Standards Act before receiving a sub-minimum wage in the 60s. As higher revenues get taxed, raising menu prices isn't guaranteed to cover expenses offset by tips or hourly pay, and restaurants that have attempted no-tipping policies have had mixed results. Driving much of this, Chris concedes, is the free market and American public itself.
If we want it as a society, we need to figure out how to pay for it as a society. But yet, at the same time, the consumer traditionally doesn't want that 12% increase of their check.
Both Charles and Chris express that to advance reform, we as a society must begin by respecting restaurant work as a viable, chosen profession and stop viewing it as unskilled labor.
You want to close that deal? You want to propose? You want just a comforting night when you've had a really bad day? You come to us. You come to this industry because we are the ones that make you feel whole again. And we are there to serve and to take care of people, but who takes care of us?
This portrait that Chris provides of the industry is grounded in more truth than romance, and is something I see in action at Blue Door. With opening approaching, I watch as the staff readies for duty. While the cooks prep, bussers form an assembly line to pour hot sauce into bottles. The maitre d' pitches in to fold napkins, and at 4:45 the manager summons the wait staff for a meeting. He informs them of the night's reservations, which include a few birthdays and guests with allergies. They go over the specials, and the sommelier reminds everyone that they'll be having a wine training later that week. At 5, the music turns on, regulars begin claiming stools at the front bar, and patrons slowly filter into the dining room. Shortly after, the kitchen gets their first order.
Fire an octopus duck terrine chilled corn soup followed by a Scottish salmon and a potato gnocchi.
A lot of work, timing, and precision goes into getting a meal like that to a table, and a far greater team effort remains to amend and make this business more equitable. Yet, as Southern Smoke illustrates, this is a fight worth waging.
Evan Stern, a sixth-generation Texan, produced and reported this episode. Evan is a storyteller, actor, oral historian, and regular contributor to Gravy. Enjoy his work? Subscribe to and like his podcast, Vanishing Postcards, named one of the best podcasts of 2022 by Digital Trends. We thank Wendell Patrick for Gravy's theme music. We also owe a huge thank you to Clay Jones and Broadcast Studios for recording and mixing Gravy. Managing editor for Gravy and all other SFA media is Sarah Camp Milam. Olivia Terentio is our podcast editor. Fact-checking comes courtesy of Heather Cole. Mary Beth Lassiter is our publisher. Visit us at southernfoodways.org to learn more about our work. And while you're there, watch a film, listen to an oral history, read an article from our sister publication, Gravy Journal, or make a donation. Your dollars fund our work and help us make more gravy. If you enjoyed this episode, tell a friend. There's plenty of gravy to go around.